Thank you all for coming. It's great to be back in San Francisco and at this great museum. I'd like to talk today about one of my favorite works of art in the Asian Art Museum's collection. And it's a beautiful painting, a very classical Chinese painting, that I first saw probably in 1976 when the Asian Art Museum was only 10 years old. And at the time in Golden Gate Park, there was a wonderful exhibition called A Decade of Collecting, which included things that had been bought in the museum's first 10 years. And this painting was in that show. And then when I was still at UCLA then, when I came up to San Francisco and started working at the museum, I really had a chance to study this painting. And I'll tell you just a little bit about it. I want to explore it from several different points of view this morning, but it's, first of all, it's one of the earliest Chinese paintings in the museum's collection. And as such, it plays an important role in helping define the whole later tradition of Chinese painting, but also it's for a long time been a bit of a mystery what exactly it is. It's not signed, so there's no real indication within the painting. There's no documentation of who the artist is. And also, I found that scholars who had studied the painting in the past had ranged from dating it to the 11th century in the northern Sung Dynasty all the way up to the Yuan Dynasty in the 14th century. That's a span of 300 years. Now, normally one should be able to be more precise. I mean, imagine in the realm of European old master painting, if you're shown a great painting, a landscape or a still life, and people can't date it precisely. They can't even decide what century it's from. That's the situation in which this painting found itself. But it's a very beautiful painting. It's on display now, as you heard. So after the talk, or maybe at the break, you can just go out this door and take a left and you'll come to it. So let me begin with a little bit of history. Because, and I want to just encapsulate the 300-year period somewhere in which this painting was created. This is a map of China in about the year 1100, at the beginning of the 12th century. China was ruled by the Sung Dynasty, at that time called the Northern Sung, surrounded by numerous kingdoms, in the north by the Liao Dynasty, and in the northwest, the Xixia Dynasty. In the year 1126, well, let me back up here. During this period, in the 12th century, in the Sung, in the early Sung Dynasty, China witnessed, among other things, the birth of a great tradition of landscape painting called the monumental landscape style. I'm just going to show you two of its best-known products. This is a work by the artist Fong Quang, who lived in the late 10th and early 11th centuries. He's a very early Sung painter. This is his only known work that is authentic. It's a huge landscape now in the National Palace Museum in Taipei and Taiwan. It's about 7 feet tall. It's one of the tallest, largest traditional Chinese paintings I know. And it was painted close to the year 1000, roughly. It celebrates nature in a very big way. It celebrates mountains. There are some tiny, tiny human figures along a mountain path down here, but they are almost extraneous to what this painting is all about. This is another great monument. By the way, I should mention that this painting, Fong Quang, which is one of the greatest masterpieces ever made of Chinese painting, this signature was only discovered in 1958. Fong Quang's actual signature hidden among some leaves of a tree, about that big, in a 7-foot painting. This painting by Guo Shi, called Early Spring, is another one of the very famous monuments of early Sung painting. It's also in Taipei in the National Palace Museum. This is also signed. There's an inscription by the artist and a date, which is rare. It's dated 1072. And it's a magnificent painting that, as it is entitled Early Spring, really depicts the earth coming alive at the end of winter and at the beginning of spring as things come out of hibernation, as ice melts and water begins to flow. And it's very much about the earth as a living, breathing body. It's a great, great painting, also an enormous work. This is another work by Guoxi. There are very few works actually known to be by this artist, and although this one is not signed, it's a section, you're looking at a detail of a hand scroll in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Its provenance can be traced all the way back to Guoxi's time. And at the end of the Northern Sung period in the early 12th century, the Sung dynasty was ruled by this emperor, Emperor Huizong, who was himself a brilliant painter, not such a great emperor. He lost his empire, in fact, toward the end of his life. He was taken prisoner by a foreign nomadic group known as the Jurchen, or the New Djinn in Chinese. But Huizong was a great painter, the best painter of all the emperors who painted, and you'd be surprised how many emperors painted in Chinese history. This is one of his several masterpieces, the five-colored parakeet in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So in the early 12th century, at the end of that emperor's reign, northern China was invaded by a foreign, non-Chinese nomadic group called the Jurchen, who take Emperor Huizong prisoner. He ended his life very unhappy, living in a tent in Inner Mongolia. And they extended their rule, the Jurchen, which created a new dynasty called the Jin. Jin means gold. It also means metal. It's one of the five elements. And the Jurchen had been a nomadic group, a tribe living on the northern border of China for many centuries. They were very skilled horsemen. They, by this time, had evolved into one of the greatest military forces in East Asia. All of their troops rode on horseback, so they conquered through the use of their cavalry. And what was left of the Sung imperial house fled to southern China and established what is known as the Southern Sung in the city of Hangzhou, which is right about here. And the Jurchen had several capitals. One was in what's now Inner Mongolia, toward the end of the Jin Dynasty. And the Jin ruled China for just over a century, northern China, from 1115 to 1234, so late 12th, early 13th century. Their later capital was where Beijing is now. So this is the period I'm going to focus on today. But I just want to take you a little further in time, because in the 13th century, a new and very belligerent group emerged north of China, the Mongols, under Genghis Khan. And this is a very rare painting, by the way, of a Jurchen nomad with his horse. This is a falconer. You can see his falcon right there. This is a Southern Sung painting of a Jurchen, very rare painting. So in the early 12th century, the Jurchen, the Sung state loses the north to the Jin, this new dynasty in 1126. The Sung capital moves to Hangzhou. And in this century or so in which northern China was ruled by the Jin, we have very little evidence of what kind of painting went on, whereas we know a lot about southern Sung dynasty painting done here in southern China. Initially, after the Jin conquered the north, and you'll notice they controlled the entire Yellow River basin here. This is the Yangtze River down here. Their border extended deep into Sung territory. Initially, there were a series of battles between the southern Sung state and the Jin, but the Jin were a superior military force. And in the end, the Southern Sung dynasty had to pay tribute on an annual basis just to buy the peace. In the early days of the Southern Sung, there was a great general, Yue, one of the most famous generals in Chinese history. This is an example of his calligraphy. That's his signature right there, Yue. He counseled the Southern Sung emperors to fight the Jin, and he had all kinds of strategies to do this. But he had enemies within the court who convinced the emperor that it was the Chinese state would be better off just paying tribute to the Jin. And one of them slandered this general, UFA, and he ended up tortured in jail and finally executed in jail. And that was really the last chance after his death for the Chinese to fight the Jurchen. But in the Southern Sung period, so in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, all the way up till about 1279, the Chinese Sung state survived in a very precarious position in southern China. And I'm showing you just a few examples of Southern Sung dynasty painting because these are so different from what happens in northern China at the same time. This is the period of some of the best-known painters in Chinese history during the Southern Sung. The great artist Ma Yuan, for example, a court painter who worked in the late 12th century and at the beginning of the 13th century. This is a fan painting by Ma Yuan in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. His contemporary Shagway, also a court painter, both of these artists very gifted at supremely subtle manipulations of ink. They are known for their very lyrical, misty, atmospheric landscapes like this. This is an album leaf by Shagway in the Tokyo National Museum, and it's actually signed by Shagway. This is very typical of Sung dynasty and even Jin painting, that signatures are hidden within the landscape, and sometimes they're very, very difficult to find. The great artist Liang Kai was a Southern Sung artist, initially a court painter, then he becomes a painter of Chan or Zen Buddhist images. These are two paintings by him, both signed. Liang Kai in Japan on the left, his very famous portrait of the Tang Dynasty poet Li Bo or Li Bai, and on the right, his imaginary depiction of the sixth patriarch of Zen Buddhism chopping bamboo. And then Mucci, a great and famous Zen monk, a Chan monk, who probably painted the most minimal landscapes ever painted in China. These are all products of Southern Sung dynasty culture in southern China in the late 12th and into the 13th centuries. One of the really great moments in the entire history of Chinese painting. But a period which the lyrical and very peaceful images that are conveyed in these landscape paintings, a period in which there was a huge amount of political tension because at any moment the Southern Sung state could be invaded by the Jurchen. And it was a very tense relationship between the North and the South. The North ruled by a foreign dynasty, the Jurchen Tartars, the Jin, the South by the Southern Sung, whose emperors were Chinese. In the end, it wasn't the Jin who conquered the Northern Sung, it was the Mongols. Under Genghis Khan in the early 13th century, and the Mongols' capital had been up in this part of, on the borderlands of Mongolia initially, but also extending into Manchuria. But the Mongols, this is Mongolia today. The Mongols in the year 1234 came in and just crushed the Jin dynasty. Their capital was in Beijing. In fact, where the Forbidden City is today, that was the Jin capital at the time. The Mongols, as you know, were ferocious warriors. They demolished the Jin state very, very quickly. It took a while for them to conquer the Southern Sung. That didn't happen until 1279. So in 1234, they conquered the Jin. In 1279, they conquered the Southern Sung and create the first Mongol dynasty in China called the Yuan. Yuan is a word that has several meanings. It can mean prime, or it can mean the first, as in number one. It can also mean primordial. It's a very common phrase used in Taoism. And the Mongols controlled China from roughly 1260 when Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, becomes the first Mongol emperor of China. There's a portrait of Kublai Khan done during his lifetime. And they established their capital in Beijing. The Forbidden City is also today on top of the foundation of Kublai Khan's palace. And they rule all the way until 1368. So the Mongols run China for a bit more than a century as well. And the Yuan dynasty in the 13th and especially in the 14th century is another great moment in the history of Chinese painting. It produces such artists as Zhao Mengfu on the left, Ni Zan on the right, both of which represent a real departure from Sung dynasty painting. But we're not going to talk about that. I want to back up and look at China in the late 12th century, when China is divided between the Jin state in the north and the southern Sung state in the south. One of the really interesting things about Chinese history is that when one dynasty conquers another, certain things happen. One of the things that was really critical, and this goes all the way back to the Han dynasty, was that it was considered very important for the new dynasty to capture the art collection of the previous dynasty. Because if you own the art collection of the last emperor of the previous dynasty, there were very little things as powerful symbolically as owning paintings that a former emperor had owned. It's one reason that the presence of the former imperial collection in Taipei today is such an incredibly powerful symbol of the political legitimacy of the Taiwanese government for people in Taiwan. This pattern, which is very ancient, continues, in other words. This painting, Guoxi's Early Spring, which I showed you before, painted during the 11th century. Guoxi was a court artist at the northern Sung court in the 11th century. This painting dated 1072. This was one of the paintings that the Djinn captured. And the earliest seal, the earliest collector's seal on this painting is the seal of one of the Jin Emperors. And it's way up here in the upper right. It's the seal of the Jin Emperor Zhangzong, who ruled for several decades right at the end of the 12th century. So we know that this was one of the early Sung paintings that came into the Jin imperial collection. It was incidentally also very important to capture the library, all the charts, all the maps, any document that could be used for political or strategic advantage. If you could conquer a dynasty without burning their palace completely, you would go into the palace and you would take all of these things, which were very important for establishing your own political legitimacy as a successor. The Jin emperors were also very fond of the paintings of Emperor Huizong, the second to the last Sung emperor whom they took prisoner. The earliest seal on this painting, which is a painting by Emperor Huizong now in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which is itself a copy of a lost Tang dynasty painting. These are the seals of the Jin emperor, Zhangzong, here, and also at the front end of the painting. So clearly there was a deep appreciation among the Jin emperors for Sung dynasty culture. And as part of another long-standing tradition or pattern in Chinese history, a so-called barbarian group that invaded China, that took over as the new rulers, were vastly outnumbered by Chinese. That was certainly true in the Qing dynasty as well, which ruled China from 1644 all the way until 1911. The Qing emperors in the Forbidden City were Manchus. They weren't Chinese. And they ruled a population that vastly outnumbered them. How do you do this? First of all, you learn Chinese. You master the Chinese bureaucracy. Foreign invaders, including Kublai Khan, had to entice Chinese bureaucrats back into government, which was always a tough decision when your kingdom had just been lost and the new emperor is not Chinese. If you were Chinese, you had to make a decision, quite often quite a difficult decision, whether to serve or not to serve. And really successful invading dynasties were blessed with first emperors who were great diplomats, who spoke Chinese, who learned how to write Chinese poetry, who could utilize the Chinese bureaucracy to their advantage and could be welcoming to Chinese scholars and officials to come back into government service. So the Jin emperors were quite good at this, even though their dynasty was very short. In terms of their spiritual life, the Jin emperors were originally shamanistic. One of their primary deities was the sun. They worshipped the sun as a deity in a very big way. This was not unusual among nomadic tribes in North Central Asia at the time. But almost immediately after becoming emperors of northern China, the Jin became Buddhist. And interestingly, Buddhism was introduced to the Jin emperors from Korea, from the Koryo dynasty, which was a fervently Buddhist period in Korean history with an incredible art tradition. And if the Jin state actually extended into part of what is now North Korea. And so they established quickly very strong diplomatic ties with the Koreans, and the Korean kings introduced Buddhism as a religion to the Jin, and they quickly adopted it. But the Jin also were great supporters of Taoism, because Taoism has always been in China a system of belief, whether a philosophy or a religion, as it also becomes with a huge pantheon, but paradoxically no supreme being, just the Tao. There are some of the best surviving early Taoist temples in China are from the Jin period. And also some of the great wooden Buddhist architecture in China are buildings in the Jin dynasty, and some of which have their mural paintings still intact from the 12th century. This is not a great slide, but I wanted to show this to you to illustrate the fact that the Jin emperors also emulated Sung dynasty imperial styles in terms of their patronage of the arts. They clearly had a great appreciation for Sung dynasty painting. The fact that they made sure to capture and make part of their own imperial palace collection paintings that had been in the northern Sung dynasty collection is one sign of this. But also the northern Sung dynasty, especially under Emperor Huizong and his predecessors, had created a painting academy within the palace. So in the late northern Sung under Emperor Huizong, really talented painters could come to the court and take an exam. They would be given topics of different subjects to paint. Quite often Emperor Huizong himself would be involved in judging which painters were of the caliber to come serve in the court. He being one of the greatest painters in China at the time, he was well suited to be that, to make those judgments. But this is one of the only paintings that survives by a Jin dynasty court artist. So we know from this, it's an artist named Zhang Kui. It's of a turtle. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it in a minute. It's actually signed. I'm sorry about the quality of this picture. It's scanned from a tiny, tiny image in a book. But this would be a late 12th century Jin dynasty court painting. And we know from that, and also the official histories of the Jin, that there was a court painting academy in the Jin palace, that artists were highly regarded, but there are only one or two works left today from the Jin court, and this is one of them. This is in the Palace Museum in Beijing, now in the Forbidden City. It depicts a turtle. The turtle, whenever you see a turtle in Chinese painting, it's not just a turtle. This is a very powerful symbol. Turtles are intimately linked in early Chinese mythology with two things, with the origins of divination and with the origins of writing. There are different myths in China about how writing evolved, but one of the most famous is that in mythical times during the reign of an ancient sage emperor, a turtle emerged out of a river, and the markings on its back inspired the creation of writing during the time of the Yellow Emperor, who, if he lived at all, this would be in the 3rd millennium BC. So it's prehistoric time as far as China goes. Turtles, another myth has it that the trigrams of the Book of Changes, the I Ching, were directly inspired by the markings on the back of a turtle, and that the I Ching is a book of divination. And very early one, its origins go back to at least the 10th century BC. And as you probably know, the I Ching is less about divining the future than divining the present. It's really about figuring out where the yin and yang energies are at a given moment so that you can make good and intelligent decisions about the future. So turtles are very powerful symbols in Chinese culture, in Chinese painting, that relate specifically to divination and to the origins of writing. And turtles live a long time, so they are also symbols of longevity. I have personally known turtles who are alive, who will live longer than I will live. I've spent time with turtles that are 80 years old, and they're still going. So turtles live certain types of turtles, not all, but certain live a very long time, and Chinese understood this. So turtles are also symbols of longevity. So bear all of that in mind. They're very interesting symbols. Whoever painted this, the artist Shagway, who painted this, knew that turtles were a symbol of longevity, and this painting was probably done as an imperial birthday present, possibly for the emperor, possibly for an empress, possibly for another member of the Jin imperial family, because out of the turtle's mouth comes a vapor here. And you can't see it, but up floating in this vapor in the cloud, written in gold, is the seal script character that says long life, Shou, as in Shou Lao, the god of longevity. So it's a perfect image to give to someone, perhaps someone who's reached at least the age of 60, maybe 70 or 80. As you know, in China, you're considered completely immature until you're 60. At 60, you begin to understand a few things about the world. When you're 70, when you're 80, then you actually are mature and actually know something. So it's amazing that, and this is one of the conundrums that art historians have faced, it's amazing that there are probably several hundred paintings surviving from the southern Sung dynasty, from that period in southern China where the Sung emperors reigned from 1127 until 1279. Many, many, many paintings. Landscape paintings, figure paintings, mythological paintings, religious paintings, still life paintings, paintings of animals. But several hundred paintings at least survive from the southern Sung dynasty. Less than 20 paintings are known from the Jin dynasty in all categories. What that means is that we know almost nothing about painting during the Jin, during this period in northern China, whether the paintings were by Jin artists, that is ethnically Jurchen artists, or most of them probably were Chinese artists living under the Jin state. But painting in northern China in the late 12th and 13th century has until recently been a complete mystery because there's just been so little evidence. So I want to show you the handful of paintings that are known to be from the Jin dynasty. And they're very different in style from those southern Sung images that I showed you earlier by Ma Yuan and Shagway and Liang Kai and Mucci. This is one of those that is signed by a Chinese artist named Wang Qing Yun. It is one of the most beautiful bamboo paintings. Bamboo and an old tree with moss growing off the branches. It's in ink on paper. It's now owned by a private museum in Kyoto, Japan, the Fuji Yurinkan, which, by the way, is one of my favorite museums of Chinese art. The Fuji family were textile merchants from Otsu up on Lake Biwa in the late 19th century during the Meiji period. And they became fantastically wealthy as the textile industry was mechanized and industrialized. And they finally moved their home to Kyoto. And one of the founders of the 20th century Fuji dynasty, it's Fuji with two eyes, Fuji, just fell in love with Chinese art. And he built a museum in Kyoto attached to his house, which is built like a Chinese pagoda. And it was really in the 1920s and 30s that he was collecting. That's when this painting would have come to Japan. I'm telling you this about the museum because the museum is only open 4 hours a month. It's open every other Sunday from 1 to 3 o'clock. So time your visit to Kyoto very carefully. But the amazing thing is when you go into this museum, and it's incidentally an incredible mirror of the profound respect for Chinese culture in Japan. It's a 4-story building. The first floor is just Shang and Zhou and Han bronzes and jades and oracle bones and such like. And then as you go upstairs, you get Buddhist art, and then you get, including Buddhist art from India and Gandhara. I mean, these collectors were very eclectic. On the top floor are paintings, and sometimes, if you're lucky, you can see this. But as I said, the museum's only open every other Sunday from 1 to 3. And their website's only in Japanese, so good luck. I've been there many times when it was shut. But you will never forget it because everything inside the museum is basically from 1928. Everything. All the labels have curled up. There are dead flies here and there. The original lamps with their silk covers, all the light switches are from the 1920s. It's like a time capsule of the 1920s. And it's very rare anywhere in Asia to see a space like that where the interior has not changed in so many decades. Anyway, this is one of the very few signed paintings from the Jin Dynasty. The turtle that I just showed you is another. This is another. This is the first Jin Dynasty landscape painting I'm showing you. This is in the Freer Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. It's called Wind and Snow in the Fir Pines. It's a classic, cold, wintry landscape. It's signed over here by a Chinese artist named Shan. And it was later in the 18th century in the Qing Dynasty imperial collection during the reign of the Qianlong Emperor. Here's the seal of the Qianlong Emperor, one of many seals. There's a poem written by the Qianlong Emperor. It says, imperially inscribed by Qianlong, right there. And it's a good example of, and a rare example of, landscape painting during the Jin Dynasty. This is another Jin painting, even though it's not signed. This is attributed to an artist named Wu Yuanzhi, and it is now owned by the National Palace Museum in Taipei. It was also in the Qing Imperial Collection. And it shows a very famous scene from Chinese literature written by the great Northern Sung poet Su Shi, or Su Dongpo. It's his visit to the Red Cliff in a boat. The poet and his friends are in a boat here on a river, and they're visiting this site of an ancient battle that had taken place in the 3rd century. And Su Shi wrote 2 poems, 2 prose poems about his visit to the Red Cliff. And even though the painting isn't signed, just about every scholar who studied this work agrees that this was painted in northern China during the Jin. And as such, it's painted, by the way, just in ink on paper. As such, it's really indicative. It's a very important reflection of the continuation of Northern Sung culture in northern China during the Jin. Su Shi was one of the favorite poets among Jin Dynasty poets, Chinese poets under the Jin. Su Shi's calligraphy was one of the primary models for Chinese calligraphers living in northern China during the Jin Dynasty in the late 12th and early 13th century, as was the calligraphy of Mi Fu, one of the greatest calligraphers in Chinese history. One thing I want you to notice about this painting, because this is going to be a trademark of Jin Dynasty landscape painting. Not only that it's painted in ink on paper, but also when you just look at the painting less as a landscape and look at it for a moment just as tonalities of ink. And look at how the dark and light ink appears in the painting. There are very strong contrasts between heavy, black, opaque ink and very pale, silvery ink throughout the painting, even within an area like this where it's just rocks, or in these large cliff faces, you see dark light, dark light, dark light, dark light, dark light, and so on. This is really typical of Jin Dynasty painting. And I'm going to show you some paintings from the Jin that don't look anything like this, but you will see the same kind of approach to how the ink is actually manipulated with the brush on the paper. This is another very good example of that technique that I'm talking about, that style. This is another painting that is widely considered to be a Jin Dynasty painting. It's in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, Missouri. It's a long hand scroll. I'm just showing you the beginning of it here. It was also in the Qianlong collection in the Forbidden City. There are numerous seals of the Qianlong Emperor and a short poem here by him. At the far end of the scroll, which I'm not showing you, this is just the first section, is a signature by an artist, but it's a nickname, Tygu Min. The leftover subject of remote antiquity is what that nickname says. Nobody knows who that is. And as you know, it's very common for Chinese artists to sign their paintings with an alternate name, a literary name, an artistic name. So to really study Chinese painting, you have to memorize hundreds of nicknames. Because in Chinese writing about painting, they love to be obscure. They won't tell you a painter's name. They'll tell you his nickname, or one of 8 different nicknames that he had. Fortunately, there are big books which give you all of these names. But this, we don't know who painted this, but it's almost certainly painted around the year 1200, right in the middle of the Jin Dynasty in northern China. And although it's somewhat different in its execution, I think you can see this pattern of continuous contrast between very heavy dark ink and very light ink or no ink in the painting. This is a very important painting because this is a 13th century, mid-13th century painting that was excavated in a tomb. So you're looking at a wall of a tomb that was found by accident when a new road was being built in the 1960s, late 60s, during the Cultural Revolution in the city of Datong, which is in northern Shanxi province, very near the Great Wall. Just outside of Datong are the Yungang caves, which are among the earliest Buddhist cave temples in China. And I'm sure many of you have been there. It's a pretty gritty town. It's one of the big centers of coal mining in China. And a construction crew was digging in the dirt to create the basis for a new road in Datong in the late 1960s, and they stumbled into this tomb, which was very rare because it had a landscape painting. Most tombs have figures, if they have any paintings on the walls at all. But this was a tomb of I believe, a Taoist priest. And they found his epitaph. They were able to identify who was buried in the tomb. And I'm going to show you 2 images. On the long wall of the tomb here, a beautiful landscape. Now this was painted, I will admit, just after the Jin Dynasty. This is sort of painted between the end of the Jin and the beginning of the Mongol period, right in the middle of the 12th century. But it was probably painted by an artist who was born in the late Jin Dynasty. And it's a very interesting landscape. There's very clear use of mist and atmosphere. It's just painted in ink on plaster. But notice again these strong contrasts of dark and light ink across the surface. That is so typical of what Jin Dynasty landscape painting was like, or one stream of Jin Dynasty painting. The archaeologists, or the construction crew, I should say, also found on an adjacent wall this painting, probably by the same artist, of a scholar seated on a riverbank looking out at a river and a distant shore, accompanied by a servant. Very sadly, the entire thing was bulldozed. It doesn't exist. It's only known from these photographs. And keep in mind, this was found during the Cultural Revolution, so although there was a great deal of archaeology done in China during the Cultural Revolution, this was not considered, I guess, sufficiently important, so the whole site was demolished. And now there's a road there. So it's very sad. These paintings are only known from these rather blurry black and white photographs. But they're important. This one especially is extremely important as an actual painting done during the 13th century in northern China, coming out of artistic traditions of the Jin Dynasty. Which brings us back to the Asian Art Museum's painting. Now, I mentioned that there's no signature on this painting. It's painted in ink and very light color on paper. It's mostly ink. It's not a huge painting. It's probably between 3 and 4 feet tall. You'll see when you go into the gallery that it presents a much more monumental image than the actual painting. I mean, that's one of the great gifts of Chinese painters, is that they can suggest something huge and unattainable and monumental in a very tiny space. So the painting begins at the bottom with a river landscape. There are these big boulders lining the riverbank with trees. You can see a little bit of color in the painting. The artist, in addition to using just ink, has used ochre, so very, very pale brownish orange, and a very, very pale blue, mostly in the trees, but by and large, most of the painting is just in ink. So it begins here with the river landscape. It's a very vertically aligned painting, or oriented, so we have these larger boulders and rocks here, and then the painting is dominated by this enormous curving, twisting cliff, which has a very distinct S curve as it ascends to the very top of the painting. There's a waterfall flowing here that presumably results in this stream that comes down and flows into the river. And back in here, almost very easily missed, I should say, is a Buddhist temple in a valley. I'll show you a detail of this in a little bit. A valley very much filled with mist. The buildings almost barely emerge out of the mist. It's something, you can look at this painting and you can be unaware that there's a whole Buddhist temple complex. Actually, I don't know that it's a Buddhist temple. There's no pagoda, but I'm assuming it's a temple complex of some kind. These are large, tiled, roofed buildings hidden in this valley. So I'd like to just show you a few details, just to explore the painting itself, its composition, and its technique. Because this is important, looking very closely at the painting is important for our being able to date it. We know that it's got to be somewhere between probably 11th century and 14th century. So how does one, as an art historian, pin it down? So here's a detail of the central section of the painting. You can see, among other things, I'd like you to notice the artist's skill in handling ink. Look at just the incredible range of tonalities. It becomes very clear when we look, here's the temple complex, which is in here. So a large gate, and then other buildings, a main hall here. Very, very subtle, fine handling of ink tonalities. One of the really interesting things about this painting is it's the artist's use of dry ink and wet ink. In fact, when you look at a painting from China, or almost any East Asian painting, you might think of it as the artist is manipulating two things. And it's really this simple. Imagine two axes, a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. One axis is dark and light. So at the one extreme, you can have ink that's really black, really opaque. And then there's this spectrum. And the other end of that spectrum is ink that's barely there, very pale, silvery. So dark and light is one axis. The other axis is wet and dry. An artist can use a lot of water in grinding their ink so that it's really, really wet. The brush is heavily laden with water mixed with ink. Or ink can be dry like charcoal, also almost barely there. Within that spectrum, those two spectra, light, dark, wet, dry, is the entire universe of ink painting. But those are the things that any artist is manipulating when they create a painting, leaving aside color, gold, other things that you might add to the surface. So notice in this painting the ink that's very dark and very dry. And notice the ink that's very wet and very pale. This artist, whoever did this, and we may never know who did this, was a master at handling ink within those four quadrants. This is the upper part of the painting, the most dramatic part of the painting, where you have this cliff that rises precipitously, with these big bulging overhangs like this. And even within 1 or 2 inches or square inches of this painting, you can see dark, opaque ink, very pale, silvery ink in these distant mountains that almost vanish because there's so little ink there. Mist floating through the valley here that comes up and hugs the base of the cliff or of the peak. And even anywhere within the painting, you see dark ink, light ink, wet ink, dry ink, and so on. It's a wonderful example of classical Chinese ink painting. Okay. I've already shown you the handful of Chinese paintings done under the Jin that are documented either through their signatures or other documentation known to have been painted in the Jin Dynasty. But since the 1960s, there's been a lot of research, both in China and in the United States, and I have to give credit here to an American scholar named Susan Bush, who did the first study in English of Jin Dynasty painting in the mid-1960s when she was, I think, still a graduate student at Harvard with the great German émigré art historian Max Lehr. Susan Bush, in the 1960s, published an article on this painting, Clearing Snow in the Min Mountains, which is now in the National Palace Museum in Taipei. And this is not signed, it's anonymous, but it has many of those characteristics that we've been talking about, which seem to be typical of Jin Dynasty landscape painting. I'll come back to this image soon, but this painting has a great deal in common with the Asian Art Museum's painting here. Not only in its structure, but also the way the rocks are painted, the use of waterfalls here, travelers across a bridge. These paintings have an enormous amount in common, just stylistically and the way the paintings are composed. And Susan Bush thinks that this painting is a late 12th century Jin Dynasty painting done in northern China, which is incidentally a very mountainous region also. So this is, it's not unusual to see scenes like this in northern China. And she traced the origins of this style to the great northern Sung artist Guo Xi, and specifically to his great masterpiece, Early Spring, from the year 1072, which we know was in the Jin territory. It was part of the Jin imperial collection in the 12th century. And particularly if you look at the peak here, which also curves as it rises, it's very similar to what happens in Guo Xi's painting. Almost without doubt, whoever did this knew of Guo Xi's great masterpiece, Early Spring. And when we compare the Asian Art Museum's painting to Clearing After Snow in the Min Mountains, one can begin to see all kinds of similarities, not only in especially in that handling of ink, the way the rocks are outlined, the way there are very dark areas and then light areas. Of course, this is a snowscape, so where the snow is, there's no ink at all. It's just the bare silk. But the contrasts of dark, light, wet, dry are very similar in the two paintings. Look at how the waterfall is painted here, and the tonalities of ink, the very pale tonalities of ink around that. I'm not suggesting that these are by the same painter, but they are really, really very close to each other. I think we're going to take a break.